The Second World War ended in 1945. But for millions of soldiers, it didn't end at all. In the United States alone, over 15 million men returned home in uniform. What almost no one mentions is what happened next. Because within the first 5 years after the war, more American veterans died at home than on the battlefield. Car accidents, alcohol poisoning, untreated wounds, silent suicides. Historians estimate that the emotional and psychological toll of coming home claimed hundreds of thousands. For many veterans, the war did not end with victory. It simply changed its shape. The battlefield moved inside the mind, and home, the place they dreamed of for years, became a new kind of front line. This is the story of that invisible war, not fought with rifles or tanks, but with memory, silence, and the struggle to rebuild a life that no longer fit. These are the underrated, overlooked lives of the men who survived combat only to face a different fight when the guns finally fell silent. August 1945. Newspapers celebrate victory. Crowds fill the streets. Flags wave from windows and rooftops. But while the nation celebrates, the trains begin to arrive. Not with triumphant heroes stepping into glory, but with thousands of quiet, exhausted men stepping onto platforms where no one truly understands what they have been through. Many wear medals. Some carry duffel bags. All of them carry something invisible. During the war, psychologists estimated that 1 in 5 combat troops suffered what they called battle fatigue. By 1947, new studies suggested the number was closer to 1 in 2. Today we would call it PTSD. Back then, it was called weakness, or worse, lack of character. No one talked about trauma. No one understood nightmares that returned every night, or sudden panic in a quiet room, or the feeling that danger was still there even when nothing was wrong. In 1946, a Veterans Administration report stated bluntly, most men will simply have to handle their own readjustment. In other words, you're on your own now. A veteran named Michael Brink wrote the day he came home, everyone is smiling. They keep saying congratulations, but I feel like I left myself somewhere in France and came home half a man. He wasn't alone. Hundreds of thousands felt the same, but they believed they had no right to say it. America had won. The world was rebuilding. A suffering veteran didn't fit the story people wanted to tell. So they stayed quiet. Some veterans became the backbone of the post-war boom. Factories, construction sites, startup families, the GI Bill. But even among them, many fought invisible battles every single day. A sudden noise triggered a panic they couldn't control. A crowded room felt like an ambush waiting to happen. Some couldn't sleep unless the lights were on. Some couldn't sleep unless the lights were off. Thousands woke drenched in sweat, hearing shells that hadn't fallen in years. There was a soldier named Robert Leary. He survived Omaha Beach, Normandy, the Hurtgen Forest, came home to Illinois. Neighbors threw a parade. A banner stretched across Main Street, "Welcome home, hero." He walked beneath it with his head down. Later he wrote, "No one asked me what I saw. No one asked me what I lost. They just asked when I was going back to work." Within 2 years, he changed 6 jobs, not because he was lazy, but because he couldn't stay near loud machinery. Every time a metal press slammed shut, his body jolted. He felt the forest again. He smelled smoke again. In 1948, he crashed his truck into a ditch, listed as an accident. His brother said, He hadn't slept right in 3 years. Others faced simpler problems and somehow harder ones. How do you live a normal life when normal no longer exists? Marine James O'Malley wrote, "People laugh here easily. It sounds like another language." He survived Tarawa, came home to a world that felt unreal. Crowds made his skin crawl. Fireworks made him drop behind a wall until the night went quiet. His wife said he kept watching the road at night, like he expected someone to come. And he did, because for years, someone always came.
There were others whose bodies came home, but whose futures did not. A paratrooper named Joseph Hale returned from Europe without his right leg. He joked about it, smiled in photographs, told everyone he was fine. But when his prosthetic broke in 1947, he couldn't afford a new one. For 2 months, he barely left his room. He wrote, "The war ended, but it keeps charging interest." By 1950, he was unemployed, drinking heavily, living alone. He died at 47. His obituary was 3 sentences. None mentioned where he fought or what he sacrificed. The truth was brutal. Winning the war was easier than winning the peace. Between 1945 and 1955, the United States and Europe saw a massive rise in alcohol abuse, early deaths, homelessness, and untreated psychological trauma among WW2 veterans. Most of it went unrecorded. Families remained silent. Governments moved on. The world wanted stories of triumph, not the reality of men who couldn't sleep through the night. Inside small apartments, farmhouses, factory rooms, and quiet kitchens at 2 in the morning, millions fought a second war. A private war. A silent war. One of the most heartbreaking stories was that of Thomas Greer, a tank gunner in the 4th Armored Division. He fought from Normandy to Czechoslovakia without a single injury. But when he returned home to Ohio in late 1945, something was wrong. He wrote to this former commander, quote, "Everything feels too quiet. I don't trust quiet anymore." He tried working in a machine shop, but the metallic clang of steel reminded him of tank shells slamming into armor. He tried farming, but the silence of open fields made him uneasy, too exposed, too vulnerable. His wife later said, quote, "He would sit on the porch for hours, looking down the road. I think he was waiting for someone who never arrived." He died in 1953 from a heart attack. He was 33. Some say it was his heart. Some say it was everything he carried inside it. Then there were the men who returned physically whole but emotionally shattered. Men who couldn't explain what they had lived through because the world around them didn't want to hear it. A bomber crewman named William Hayes described his first night home. Quote, "My mother made dinner. I sat at the table. Everyone talked. But the only thing I heard was the sound of engines, as if the house itself was flying." He had flown 27 missions over Germany. He had seen planes burn, crews vanish, men bail out with shoot or die decisions in seconds. At home, no one asked. They assumed silence meant strength, but silence, to Hayes, meant survival. He never flew again. Another untold chapter of veterans' lives was illness, physical and chemical. Thousands of soldiers fought through jungles in Burma, New Guinea, and the Philippines. They battled malaria, dysentery, fungal infections, and starvation. When they came home, many carried chronic illnesses that doctors barely understood. Veteran Joe Ramirez wrote, quote, "I beat the Japanese, but malaria beat me every year afterward." One fever in 1949 nearly killed him. Another veteran, Arthur Stevens, survived 3 years as a POW under the Japanese. He returned home weighing 92 pounds. His body healed, his mind, not fully. He couldn't sleep in a soft bed. He slept on the floor for the rest of his life. His daughter later said, quote, "He told us he didn't trust pillows. He said that's when they came for you." There were veterans who rebuilt their lives brilliantly. But even among the success stories, the scars remained. Take John Harrison. He returned from Europe, got a degree, became a lawyer, and eventually a judge. From the outside, he was the perfect example of post-war American prosperity. But his son remembered one moment. Quote, "Whenever a car backfired, my father would pause mid-sentence, like he was counting seconds. Counting seconds, the instinct of a soldier who knew that after the first blast, another often followed. Success didn't erase the war, it simply covered it." For many veterans, though, the hardest part of returning wasn't trauma, it wasn't injury, it wasn't memory, it was loneliness. During the war, soldiers lived in tight-knit groups, squads, crews, platoons. They depended on each other, and in that dependence, they found a family. Coming home meant losing that family overnight. No more shared danger, no more shared purpose, no more men who understood without a single word spoken. A veteran named Daniel Morris wrote, quote, "I miss the war, not the fighting, but the brothers." His therapist later said it was the most honest sentence she'd ever read about returning home. Women veterans faced a different struggle, one almost never discussed. Tens of thousands served as nurses, analysts, mechanics, communications officers, but when the war ended, many were forced back into traditional domestic roles. A nurse named Eleanor Foster, who treated wounded Marines on Iwo Jima, later said, quote, "They let me sew up men under fire, but they wouldn't let me sign for a mortgage." Her service uniform went into a trunk. Her rank disappeared. Her war erased. She kept the trunk closed for the next 30 years. Children felt the war too. They grew up watching fathers who were present but distant, gentle but unpredictable, loving but haunted. One daughter wrote of her father, quote, "He never yelled, he never hit us, but sometimes he would stare through me, like he was looking at something far away." Another said, quote, "My father built our house with his own hands, but he couldn't build peace inside himself." By the 1960s, researchers finally began connecting the dots. The silent suffering, the early deaths, the addictions, the broken families. It took the world 20 years to understand a truth veterans already knew. Surviving the war did not mean surviving the aftermath.
But for all the hardship, loneliness, and shadows that followed these men home, there was another truth that history often forgets. Many veterans rebuilt their lives not because they escaped the war, but because they carried its lessons with them. Resilience, brotherhood, discipline, and an unbreakable will to keep moving forward. There was a man named Harold Bishop. He fought in North Africa, Sicily, Normandy, and finally Germany. He saw things that no human should ever see. He returned home with trembling hands and nightmares that lasted years. But in 1952, he opened a small bakery, Bishop's Bread. He worked every morning at 4 a.m. He trained young employees patiently. He gave free bread to families who struggled. When he died at 82, the entire town attended his funeral. One man said, "He never talked about the war, but he lived every day like someone who understood the value of peace." Another example was Samuel Price, a navigator on a B-17 bomber. He survived being shot down, months in a German POW camp, and the harsh winter of 1944. He returned home weighing 110 pounds, but he finished his education, became an engineer, and helped design early weather satellites. He once told a colleague, "When you've survived falling from the sky, solving a technical problem doesn't scare you." His daughter later said, "Dad didn't talk about bombs or camps. He talked about possibilities." But even the success stories carried quiet scars. A Marine rifleman named Henry McAllister returned from the Pacific and became a school teacher, beloved by his students, respected by everyone. But every year on the first day of school, when he heard lockers slam in the hallway, his breath caught in his throat. He hid it, well, for 50 years. When he passed away in 2008, his family found a small box in his closet. Inside were 2 medals, a faded photograph of 4 Marines, and a note. "I made it home. They didn't." And then there were veterans whose lives changed the nation itself. The GI Bill sent millions to college, men who otherwise would never have walked inside a university. They became scientists, doctors, engineers, teachers. They built highways, businesses, entire industries. They fueled the American middle class. Yet even among the most successful veterans, the war lingered like a shadow. A senator who served in Italy later said, "People ask what combat taught me. The truth is, it taught me to listen." The war shaped not only the men who fought, but the families they built and the children they raised. Many children of W2 veterans remembered fathers who were present but emotionally distant. Fathers who worked tirelessly but could not rest. Fathers who loved deeply but struggled to show it. One woman wrote, "When Dad tucked us in at night, he always checked the hallway and the windows. He never said why. He didn't need to." Some children grew up afraid of their father's anger, sudden, unpredictable, and gone as quickly as it appeared. Others grew up admiring their quiet strength, discipline, and loyalty. A son of a veteran once said, "My father never cried, except once, when he talked about the men who didn't come home." But one of the most extraordinary and least acknowledged contributions of World War II veterans was emotional endurance. These men lived with fear and still built families. They lived with trauma and still went to work every morning. They lived with sorrow and still found moments of joy. They lived with loss and still created new lives. That kind of quiet resilience rarely makes headlines, but it shaped the modern world more than any battle they ever fought. Some veterans found healing not through forgetting the war, but through service after it. Many became firefighters, police officers, paramedics, postal workers, community volunteers. Work that required calm under pressure. Work that demanded self-sacrifice. They were good at that. They had practice. There was a medic named Frank Delgado. He saved lives in France, Italy, and Germany. When he came home, he joined a small-town fire department. For 30 years, he was the first to arrive at every emergency call. His captain said he walked into burning buildings like they were just another bad day in Europe. When Delgado retired, he told a young firefighter, "We never stopped being who the war made us. We just tried to use it for something good." But not every veteran could find his place. A man named Leonard Brooks served as an infantry scout in the Pacific. He came home with 2 Bronze Stars and a Purple Heart. But the war stole from him something that no medal could replace: the ability to feel safe. He lived in a small apartment above a hardware store. Neighbors said he kept the radio on all night because silence frightened him. He died in 1962, alone. His landlord found a shoebox under his bed. Inside was a letter he wrote to himself. "You survived. Now try to live." The letter was never sent, because perhaps he didn't know how. By the late 1970s, researchers, psychologists, and historians finally began to understand what these men had carried. Not weakness, not instability, but trauma, the natural human response to unnatural experiences. Veterans who had been dismissed for decades were now being recognized for what they truly were: survivors of a war that did not end when the shooting stopped. A new term entered the medical world: post-traumatic stress disorder. But long before the textbooks, long before the diagnosis, long before society understood, veterans understood each other. They always had. They always would.
By the time America truly began to understand its veterans, many of them were already gone. Some lived long lives, raised families, built homes, found purpose. Others slipped quietly through the cracks of a society that didn't yet know how to help them. But all of them, every single one, carried memories the world could not see. There is a photograph taken in 1946 of a veteran named Peter Klein. He stands in his backyard holding his newborn daughter. He is smiling. She is wrapped in a white blanket. To anyone else, it is a simple family picture. But on the back, in Klein's handwriting, are 4 words: "I lived for this." He had survived the Battle of the Bulge. He had watched friends freeze to death. He had wondered, more than once, whether he would ever see home again. For him, this moment, a quiet backyard, a baby in his arms, was victory. Not the parades, not the medals, not the speeches. Just this: a life continued. There was another veteran, a radio operator named Albert Rosen. He rarely talked about the war. His children grew up knowing he served, but not knowing how deeply it marked him. Only after his death in 1993 did they discover the letters he never sent. Dozens of them, pages and pages written to no one. In one letter he wrote, "I miss the war. Not the killing, not the fear, but the feeling that we were all in something together." He ended the letter with, "At home, everyone is alone." His family said those words explained more about him than anything he ever said aloud. Community, or the loss of it, became one of the defining struggles for World War II veterans. During the war, they lived shoulder to shoulder, shared danger, shared hardship, shared life. But when they came home, that world disappeared overnight. No more barracks, no more squads, no more men who understood the language of survival. Veteran support groups didn't exist yet. Therapy was rare and stigmatized. Most men tried to cope alone. Many succeeded. Many didn't. One veteran, a rifleman named Charlie Donnelly, said something that historians now quote often: "When I came home, I didn't know who I was without the war." He had been 19 when he landed in Normandy, 21 when he returned home. For 2 years, every choice he made had been life or death. Suddenly, people asked him what job he wanted, what color to paint the house, whether he wanted toast or biscuits. He wrote, "I didn't care about toast. I cared about the men who died beside me." Donnelly eventually became a carpenter, a good one. He built homes all over New Jersey. But he never stopped having the same dream: walking through fog, calling out names who never answered. And yet, through all the silence, all the pain, all the things they carried, World War II veterans transformed the world more profoundly than any headline ever captured. They built modern society, literally. They poured the concrete for highways. They wired the electricity in new neighborhoods. They taught in schools. They ran firehouses and post offices. They opened diners, repair shops, hardware stores. They built the world they once feared they would never live to see. And many did find peace, eventually. Not by forgetting the war, but by giving meaning to the life that followed it. A veteran named Raymond Holt found peace in woodworking. Another in gardening. Another in coaching Little League baseball. One man who fought on Okinawa spent his entire retirement volunteering at a children's hospital. When asked why, he said, "I saw too much death when I was young. Now I want to give life." As the decades passed, the veterans aged. Their uniforms faded. Their stories softened. The world moved forward. But the weight they carried, the private battles, the unseen wounds, the quiet heroism, remained part of them until the very end. Today, fewer than 1% of World War II veterans are still alive. Every day, the world loses another piece of living history. But their legacy is not just the war they fought. It is the world they helped build afterward, the families they raised, the cities they constructed, the freedoms they protected, and the strength they showed, not in battle, but in the decades that followed, when no one was watching. If you walk through an old cemetery in America, Europe, or the Pacific, you will sometimes see a small bronze star on a headstone. It marks the grave of a World War II veteran. Below it, 2 dates: the day they were born and the day they died. But what those 2 dates don't show is everything that happened in between. The nightmares, the courage, the loneliness, the rebuilding, the silence, the love, the stubborn will to keep living even when life didn't come easy. Between those 2 dates lies a story far bigger than most of us will ever know. A story not of war, but of survival after it. A story of ordinary men who endured extraordinary things, first on the battlefield and then at home. These were the underrated lives of World War II veterans, and their quiet victories, their hidden wounds, and their enduring strength shaped the modern world more than any headline ever written. Because history is not just the story of battles won, it is the story of lives rebuilt, one day, one family, one fragile piece at a time.